Watson from Harvard is going to talk to us about his work studying the effects of early psychosocial neglect on brain and behavioral development.
Thanks, Josh. So in the phone calls that led up to the planning of this particular panel, when it was decided that Matt would talk about the powerful role that genetics plays in regulating typical and atypical development, we thought a juxtaposition to that would be to talk about the powerful role that the environment plays in regulating development. So let's just start with a little bit of background with the role of experience in brain development. We know that many aspects of brain development depend on experience that occurs during critical periods. That experience cuts both ways. If a child is exposed to adverse experiences during a critical period or deprived of expectable experiences, brain development can be undermined. And by expectable, I simply mean those things that the species have come to expect will be present in the environment at birth. Brain plasticity changes with age. In some domains, change is possible throughout the lifespan. Learning and memory would be the example of that. Whereas in others, change is much more difficult. And sadly, this is a slide that illustrates this. The red line represents the decline in brain plasticity with age, in part due to the increased physiologic effort required to enhance neural connections. And many of us are past that intersection of those two, you'll notice now. And if I had more time, I would show a video of myself playing squash with my adult son. I've played squash many more years than he has, but he started at 2 and I did not, and you probably can fill in the rest of the story. So what I'm going to talk about today is what happens to brain development when there's a profound violation of the expectable environment during a critical period. And so the question is, can the deleterious effects of early psychosocial neglect be reversed, and if so, are there temporal constraints on doing so? So I'm going to be drawing from a project that is now in its 16th year called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, led by my colleagues Charles Zena and Nathan Fox. When we began this in roughly 1999 or 2000, the Romanian government believed that institutional care was superior to family care for abandoned children. And we were invited in by a member of the government who thought otherwise. And the goal was to provide scientific evidence that would support one position or another in the government. So we designed a randomized controlled trial of foster care as an intervention for the early institutional care. As I said, it was launched around 16 years ago, and we continue to see our children at this point in time. We began with 136 infants who had been abandoned to institutions soon after birth. Following an extensive baseline assessment, half of these infants were randomly assigned to a high-quality foster care program that we created, we maintained, and we paid for. There was no foster care in Bucharest when we started this. The other half were randomly assigned to what we call care as usual, continued institutional care. Also recruited was a sample of never institutionalized infants who lived with their parents in the greater Bucharest community. So this is what we found 10 years after the fall of Ceausescu in 1989. On the right, you'll see a room of, there can be 10 to 15 babies lying in cribs, staring at white ceilings with no stimulation. And on the left, you might see a room of toddlers. In this case, if I let this play long enough, there'd be about 20 toddlers in there with one caregiver. And about a minute or two from now, you will see, which is the pointer? The green? Well, we don't have a pointer because
yes,
if I point at this, doesn't really help you.
Yes.
What you will see is that almost all infants in this room will eventually engage in stereotypy. See the child rocking there, and then the second child rocking, and now the third child, and that just continues. And stereotypies are a hallmark feature of neglect. So I'm going to talk about two basic findings: brain development and the response to a stressor. So we recorded the brain's electrical activity at baseline, and we continue to do this under resting conditions. We can look at the distribution of the electrical activity across the scalp surface, and we can color code this with red representing more activity and green representing less. If you look at the upper figure, you see the brain activity. So the triangle is the nose, back of the head, left ear, right. It's viewed from the top. And you can see how much less brain activity there is among the institutionalized children. Keep in mind that this is at baseline when the average age was around 20 months, so they haven't even spent all that much time yet in an institution, but already we see a diminution in brain activity. Now let's fast forward to the age of 8, and now look at the intervention effects. Upper left, you see the brain activity of the institutionalized group, and in the upper right, you see the children placed in foster care after the age of 2, and they're identical. Lower left, you see the children placed in foster care before 2, compared to the lower right, the never institutionalized children, and they're identical. So what we see here then is a timing effect. Placement before 2 led to a normalization of this brain response. Placement after 2 did not. Let's now talk about the ability to respond to a stressor. Early in life, we learn to deal with stressors by having caregivers who help us mount an appropriate response to a stressor. So we did a task where the children at 8 and 12 and now 16 were asked to give a talk to an audience where some audience members look neutral and others look negative. Hypothetically, this would be me talking to my lab. And during that time, we're recording physiological activity like heart rate, skin conductance, respiration, blood pressure, cortisol, and the like. So let me just talk about the cortisol data. Cortisol is a hormone that's released under stressful conditions. And TSST is the time when the child is actually giving the speech. And you'll notice that for the never institutionalized children, there's a large increase in a court response. But you don't see any increase in court for the institutionalized or the foster care kids, except if you divide the foster care sample into 2, those placed before and after 24 months, you see those placed before 24 months show a perfectly appropriate court response. You expect under a stressor, heart rate to increase, blood pressure to increase, cortisol to be secreted. You see that only in the children placed before 24 months. So in conclusion, children experiencing early psychosocial deprivation experience significant delays and impairments in physical, cognitive, linguistic, social, emotional, and brain development compared to never institutionalized children. That children removed from such settings and placed into families, good families, generally before the age of 2, show far greater recovery in most domains that we've examined. However, not all domains show recovery of function. We see a high and persistent deficit in many executive functions, and the prevalence of ADHD is unremitting. It's at around 20%, even in the kids in foster care. Of those that do show recovery, not all are regulated by critical periods. We show a dramatic reduction in anxiety, but it's unregulated by critical periods. If you take the child and put them into a family, you see a reduction in anxiety. So there's variability in outcome depending on placement timing and individual differences in response to context, institutional care versus family care. Thanks very much.
Forward.